Few aircraft of World War II earned their place in aviation history with as much pure infamy as the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber. One of the most important requirements for the new Luftwaffe was a dive bomber to support ground operations. This was fulfilled by the Junkers Ju-87 heavy dive bomber, known as the Stuka. The concept of dive bombing was certainly not unique to the German Luftwaffe. The British were the first to use the technique during World War I. After the end of the war, the RAF conducted further research and development, but finally ended their efforts when it was determined that air crews were too much at risk affecting it. Instead, the British chose to concentrate their efforts on the creation of a strategic bomber force. After Hitler came to power in 1933, clandestine development in all forms of air power began in earnest. Ernst Udet, the head of the aircraft development program of the Reich Luftwaffe, was very impressed with the demonstrations he saw in the USA in 1933. After he had flown the Curtiss Hawk, he bought two, which he demonstrated in Germany. This helped to advance the concept of dive bombing in Germany. In fact, the emphasis on the Stuka indicated a growing preference among German planners for dive bombers rather than level bombers. It was thought that the former were likely to be much more accurate against pinpoint targets, such as troop concentrations. This was true, and the Stuka would soon come to be dreaded throughout Europe. But the Stuka development program also diverted resources from the development of the so-called Ural bomber, which was planned for strategic attacks on long-range enemy targets. This created an unbalanced force that the Luftwaffe would pay dearly for over England and in Russia. The birth of the Stuka began in 1936, when the Luftwaffe asked the major aircraft manufacturers for a new bomber to replace the old HS-123. The Stuka Ju-87A was born, and it took only a short time to develop an aircraft suitable for the upcoming struggle. This would be the Ju-87B. It was to be the standard model during the early years of World War II. It was powered by the powerful UMO 211 engine. This engine had fuel injection, an important feature for an aircraft which had to be subjected to heavy G-forces and acrobatic maneuvers. A new engine cowling was designed, with a new air intake on top of the cowling and a deep, half-circular radiator under it. The radiator was larger for the B-2 model than for the B-1 because the B-2 had an even more powerful engine. The trousered undercarriage of the A model was replaced by a spatted one, with closer-fitting leg covers and better streamlined wheel spats. The change was more than cosmetic, for the undercarriage was also redesigned and considerably strengthened. The main wheels were also moved slightly backwards. If the Ju-87 had to operate from poor airfields, such as found at the Eastern Front, the spats were often removed because they tended to get clogged with mud. The stresses of operating from primitive airfields demonstrated that it was not uncommon for Ju-87s to have their undercarriages completely ripped off when operating from such airfields. On the undercarriage legs, a fitting was installed for a siren, a so-called Jericho trumpet, to enhance the effect on morale of the Ju-87's attacks. This was driven by a small propeller on the left undercarriage leg. When the siren was not installed, the mount was faired over, leaving a protrusion on the undercarriage. The sirens were mostly discarded during the Battle of Britain because they reduced the performance of the already slow and vulnerable Ju-87. The greenhouse canopy of the Ju-87B was also different than that of the Ju-87A. with sliding sections for the pilot and the gunner, which replaced the earlier hinged entry panels. On the 1st of September 1939, at 0426 hours, 3 Ju-87Bs took off for the very first bombing attack of World War II, before the official declaration of war. The first day of the war was not an overall success for the Luftwaffe and the Ju-87. Most of their strength was sent far behind the lines to destroy the Polish Air Force on the ground, but without conclusive results. It was estimated that the Poles lost about 30 aircraft by that effort. But during the ensuing days, the cooperation between the German ground forces and the Stukas proved to be excellent. Every time the Polish army tried to organize resistance to the rapid advance of the tanks, Stukas were called in to destroy it. The Germans made a propaganda movie about the Ju-87 and the devastation it had caused in Poland. Allegedly, the Germans bombarded parts of Warsaw after the end of the fighting to get more impressive footage for this production. It ended with a threat against England if it did not seek peace. As far as England and the Ju-87 were concerned, it was a hollow threat. Still, for those on the ground in Poland, the Stuka became a frightening symbol of what Winston Churchill would refer to as the power of perverted science. For the Stuka pilot, the decision to dive was a fateful one, not just for those on the ground, but the pilot as well. Once into his dive, if there was a problem, bailing out would be almost impossible. He would also run the risk of blacking out due to great G-forces. The bomber could reach a speed of up to 350 miles per hour. There was little reason for the Stukas to get involved in the land battle during the fight in the Scandinavian countries. It could be put to much better use in attacks against Allied shipping, which was trying to supply their own expeditionary forces in Norway and prevent the Germans from reinforcing theirs. The Stukas concentrated mainly on Allied attempts to recapture Narvik and Trondheim through landings at Harstad, Namsen, and Andesnes. The German drive into the heart of Norway was efficient and swift. The Norwegian army fought bravely, but they were no match for the Nazis. The British troops likewise fought hard, but were severely hampered by lack of suitable equipment and sometimes very weak leadership. The Stukas were able to pave the way for the German ground troops, as they had so effectively done in Poland. Soon, the British were forced back to the sea, where the Allied forces would be rescued by the Royal Navy. It was an operation that none realized would soon be repeated on a much larger scale at Dunkirk. The campaigns in Poland and Norway, despite the pain inflicted on the people in those nations, were mere sideshows compared to what the Germans had in mind now. A blitzkrieg into France and towards Britain through the Low Countries. It was May 1940, perfect flying and fighting weather for the Luftwaffe. It was here the Stukas really proved their effectiveness. It was not merely its accuracy as a dive bomber, but also the terror that it spread among combatants and civilians alike that was decisive. Of course, it did not help that much of the French high command was in disarray. They had 2 commanders and 3 headquarters, and none of the French side had a clue about what was happening at the front, nor did it improve things that French generals had been too complacent to properly train their soldiers. The French had expected that after any serious move made by the Germans, they would have days or weeks to react, while reinforcements and artillery were laboriously moved to the front line. After all, that was what had happened in the First World War. Besides, now they had the Maginot Line. The von Schlieffen plan to pivot through the Low Countries was thought impossible this time due to the thickness of the forested Ardennes. Tanks could not make it through, or so it was thought. The fatal breakthrough on 13 May near Sedan was preceded by an attack of the Ju-87s on the positions of the French defenders. Small groups of Stukas methodically attacked the villages in the front lines, road crossings, and artillery positions. Even the Germans, moving forward under protection of these attacks, were frightened, perhaps understandably, because there had been a few friendly fire incidents during the campaign in Poland. The French general Hunziker refused to call in Allied fighters to chase the Stukas away because of the possibility of friendly fire decimating his own troops. The antiquated prevailing view was that the Air Force was a vulnerable weapon that would soon be lost if it were used. General Gamelin is alleged to have predicted that it will burn itself in a flash. When the French commanders realized the consequences of such flawed thinking, they began to ask for British fighter aircraft to protect their troops. They were unaware that because of monumental incompetence and intelligence failures, most of their own French Air Force had remained inactive. 3/4 of the French fighters were never committed to the battle, and the Luftwaffe was free to attack anything that moved. When the aircraft was reasonably close to the target, a light on the contact altimeter came on to indicate the bomb release point, usually at a minimum height of 1,500 feet. The pilot released the bomb by depressing a knob on the control column to release weapons and to initiate the automatic pull-out mechanism. An elongated U-shaped crutch located under the fuselage would swing the bomb out of the way of the propeller, and the aircraft would automatically begin a 6G pullout. Some French units launched limited counterattacks, such as General de Gaulle's 4th Armored Division, but they were immediately attacked by the Ju-87s and forced to retreat. Luftwaffe's attack on Dunkirk showed the limitations of both the Luftwaffe and the Ju-87. The French and British soldiers, finally accustomed to the screaming attacks of the dive bombers, resisted admirably, defending the city until almost all the British and many of the French soldiers could be evacuated across the Channel. At the same time, the operations of the RAF to protect the evacuation caused heavy losses for the attackers, although large numbers of Allied ships and boats were sunk or damaged. It was the first sign of the vulnerability of the Ju-87. Still, the Stukas did much damage, and inevitably, Dunkirk fell, although most of the British Army was able to escape the clutches of the Germans, just in time. Nevertheless, the Stukas played havoc with the rescued BEF. For the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe amassed a force that included 336 Ju-87s, of which about 280 were operational. But the contribution of the Ju-87 to the attack on Britain was brief, and in fact, mainly limited to the attacks on shipping in the Channel during the initial stages. Here, the Ju-87 was effective enough, and the Royal Navy was forced to remove a destroyer flotilla from Dover and give orders that destroyers would only pass the Straits of Dover during the night. There were also a number of attacks on convoys off the British coast. The best known of these was the fight off Eastbourne, which was reported live by the BBC. Three ships were damaged in the battle, but 7 Stukas were shot down with the loss of only 1 Hurricane. The Stukas then turned their attention to the British airfields. But by now, the fighter command had taken the Stukas' measure, and the attacks of the next days would make it clear that the Ju-87 was a sitting duck for the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF. On 18 August, the so-called Stuka slaughter of Thorney Island, when a large formation was caught without fighter cover, cost the Luftwaffe 30 Stukas, shot down, crash-landed, or damaged beyond repair. This forced the Luftwaffe to pull back the Stukas from the offensive against Britain. They continued operating against shipping in the Channel, also at night, but no longer participated in the main effort. During the opening day of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, air support was not as adequate as it had been in France. The Luftwaffe was, by now, overextended. So many aircraft were needed in the West and the Mediterranean that too few were available for the Russian campaign. The main task for the Ju-87 on the Eastern Front was the destruction of enemy tanks. One of the intelligence failures of the German High Command was not to realize just how many tanks the Russians were capable of fielding. The numbers were vastly more than they thought for in the planning stages of Operation Barbarossa. And the Russian T-34 tank was the equal of anything but a German Tiger tank. And the Germans had not brought near enough of those. Confronted with the presence of large numbers of excellent T-34 tanks and the disappointing production of their own industry, the Germans sought to compensate their numerical inferiority in other ways. For the Ju-87, it was a target-rich environment. The giant tank battle of Kursk, the largest ever, saw the participation of large numbers of Ju-87s. But the Ju-87s now had to operate from very primitive airfields, at the end of long supply lines and in a harsh climate. Aircraft had usually to be maintained in the open air, and hangars or shelters for parked aircraft were non-existent. The Russian winter, as it had proved in Napoleon's time, was the best ally the Russians had. Because of the perilous nature of aerial tank busting in a low, slow-moving airplane like the Stuka, the armor of the plane was substantially increased. Of course, it became even more dangerous when the Soviet Air Force gained the upper hand, because it first and foremost wanted to achieve tactical air superiority over the battlefield, where the Ju-87s flew. The obsolescence of the Ju-87 was now perilously obvious, and it began to be replaced by fighter bombers like the Focke-Wulf F-190. Any effectiveness the Stuka was able to retain was due solely to the vastly experienced air crews keeping it airborne. The most successful Stuka pilot was Hans Ulrich Rudel, who was to become the most decorated German pilot of World War II. He was also the pilot who flew the most combat missions, a staggering 2,530. He was credited with the destruction of the battleship Marat, 519 tanks, and over 2,000 other vehicles. According to one rumor, Hitler was so impressed by Rudel's actions that he contemplated naming him as his successor. The Stuka remained in production until October 1944, almost 8 years since the first plane rolled off the assembly line. By then, it was a sadly outdated aircraft.